I would like to welcome you all to this webinar organized by European Foundation for Democracy in cooperation with the US mission to the EU. We organized this webinar under EFT's Disinformation program. Disinformation campaigns during the COVID-19 crisis have been targeting the EU countries, but equally they were also targeting the candidate states of the EU with anti-West, anti-EU messages, basically to discredit the EU and the West in general. So we will try to explore this issue today with three excellent speakers. We have Edward Joseph from Johns Hopkins University, Ilija Vojnovic from International Republican Institute, and Nevşin Mengü, a well-known Turkish journalist. I would like to thank to all our speakers for joining us today. I think we are hosting Ilija first time, but Edward, Nevşin, I think we had a pleasure to host you for several occasions, so welcome back. Our speakers will open the session by their analysis for about 8 to 10 minutes, and then we will continue with a Q&A. You can type your questions and comments during and after presentations by using the Q&A box on your screen. So we will start with Edward with the Western Balkans, and then Ilija will make the connection between Western Balkans and Turkey with similarities and differences, and Nevşin will continue with what's going on in Turkey. Edward, thanks so much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you. Great to see you again. And very nice to be on this panel with Ilija and Nevşin, and looking forward to a great discussion. Greetings to all those who are watching from here, just outside Washington, D.C. Nothing happening in the United States these days. Very quiet here, no developments of note. Of course, kidding. This is a tumultuous time in the U.S. Here, and believe it or not, there is actually a connection, and a rather timely one, to the Western Balkans. And let me begin with that as the entree into this, the tangential point that I'm about to describe is the announcement yesterday that, or on Monday, that the White House will be hosting the Serbian and Kosovo leaders in what is being billed as a major breakthrough on Kosovo. And it's very clear that this is driven by Richard Grenell, who is the US ambassador to Germany. And it's been a long time preoccupation of his, and even as high as President Trump, to get a breakthrough deal on Kosovo. What's a concern, and the relationship to the topic we have about Russian and Chinese interference and involvement in the region, is the way that Grenell and the White House are going about this. What is the most significant concern is, among several, is the timing. This event was scheduled hastily for next week, actually June 27th, to steal the possibility of the Europeans, Macron and Merkel, from hosting their own Kosovo summit in Paris also this month, possibly on the very same day. And what Grenell has done is, in the most brazen fashion, has preempted the Macron-Merkel summit with the Serbian and Kosovo leaders in a brazen and blatant attempt to insert the White House and achieve its objectives for a deal and diplomacy on Kosovo instead of the Europeans. So how does that relate to Russia and China? Very simply, It is the latest example of division in the West at the very moment when Russia and China are closer than ever on their own designs in the Balkans, intensified after the COVID-19, the ongoing and still unfolding COVID-19 pandemic. So what you have here is the confluence, the worst possible scenario is just as Russia and China are absolutely redoubling their efforts in the region, including with the largest country in former Yugoslavia, Serbia, actively welcomed in this regard by the Serbian president, Aleksandar Vučić, who has elections coming up soon. So just at this moment of heightened attention and even competition between the East and West in the Balkans, a new and intensified locus of competition, you have the most brazen possible split in the West between the US and EU, who of course should be unified and in their efforts in the Balkans, both on Kosovo and also on resisting malign Russian and Chinese influence. So let's turn to that influence now and just take a couple of minutes and look at the ways that it has intensified. Let's separate them, Russia and China, because in a way, their influence is distinct, and yet here's the significant point, quite compatible, eminently compatible. So the overall objectives of Moscow and Beijing are similar, quite similar, but their tactics and their approach are different. Fundamentally, Russia and Moscow are each trying to assert strategic objectives through their malign influence in the Balkans. So that's fundamental, is shared. They may have slight differences as to how they see their strategic interests being achieved in that region, but that is, in each case, that is their bedrock goal. And that goal, and this is another fundamental point, it's less an affirmative goal than it is a negative goal. It's an antagonistic goal. It's in opposition to the West. That's the primary impetus for Russian and Chinese action. It isn't necessarily to create and build something of their own, although of course China with its Belt and Road projects is constructing something. But in their wider strategic aims, it's primarily an antagonistic posture. This is very evident when we look at Russia. Russia's goal in the Balkans isn't necessarily to convince even Serbia to say, you don't need to join the EU, you come with us, even though Putin has made gestures in that regard that again are reciprocated, and this cannot be emphasized enough, actively embraced and reciprocated by Aleksandar Vučić. So even though Putin wants to attract Serbia, his initial aim is mainly to frustrate Western ambitions, that is the inclusion, the steady inclusion of the region in Euro-Atlantic postures. And so we see this in the disinformation campaign that Russia supports in Serbia and in the region of creating confusion, creating doubt, creating wherever it can disinterest in the Western project, trying to expose what it perceives to be hypocrisy in the democratic process. We also see Russia, of course, in playing a strong role in the energy sector and, of course, in the military sector with weapons supplies to Serbia. And ultimately, we know both Russia and China sit on the UN Security Council and therefore play a major role in defending Serbia's position on Kosovo. Now let's quickly take the rest of the time and look at China, because this is the most interesting part. This is what's new. The Russia part has been longstanding. It was intensified during COVID. Russia also sent support to Serbia for COVID-19. But it's really the Chinese support that has taken the relationship to a new level. Again, look at the shared tactics. The most significant part of the support from Russia and China was not the PPE, was not the actual material, although that was significant, which included even ventilators. What was most significant in both cases was the personnel that each sent. So from Russia, you had military experts in NBC, that is nuclear, biological, chemical, who were visible, seen visibly, working, helping Serbia disinfect specific locations, and in China's case, even more visible. Chinese experts from Wuhan province coming over and advising, almost directing the Serbian response to COVID-19, implementing the same very strict identify and quarantine approach. And in turn, and again, this can't be emphasized enough, you have President Vučić openly, actively embracing to an almost unimaginable degree the Russian, the Chinese assistance, kissing the Chinese flag, erecting numerous billboards around Belgrade and beyond with almost a cult-like image of Xi Jinping that says, "Thank you, brother Xi." And Vučić does this as he also lashes out, castigates the EU for its lack of support initially. Ultimately, the EU delivered more assistance in financial terms than China and Russia, significantly more. But, and Vučić only, as is his wont, acknowledges this, but only in a very low-key way. And the main narrative, the main impression given to the Serbian public is that it is Russia, of course, but newly China, which is the great friend and the dependable ally of the Serbian people. In here, again, let's look at the Chinese approach versus the Russian, mainly in the economic sphere, but increasingly that economic interest turns into political gain. Vučić came out strongly in contravention, of course, to the US and EU position, strongly backing China over its actions in Hong Kong. Again, in complete contravention to what the West is saying. Serbia has long refused to impose sanctions, join in the sanctions on Russia over Ukraine and Crimea, of course. But this is also, we see the political gain here for China. China's inroads into Serbia in particular, they extend, we should say, this emphasizes, China's active throughout the Balkans. So it's not only in Serbia. What's unique in Serbia is the extent of the relationship, and here, the embrace that the Serbian leader, Aleksandar Vučić, gives to China. It's not matched in any other country in the Balkans. And the extent of the Chinese activity and penetration is substantial. These are quite significant projects beyond Belt and Road. China has control over a steelwork, is building one of the largest factories under a roof, under a single roof anywhere in the Balkans. China controls and operates one of the largest copper mines in the world in Serbia. Each of these obtained in direct investment, not open tender, not a bid. And in one of these cases, in the case of a Belt and Road project, the railway between Budapest and Belgrade, the EU has even intervened and investigated as it contravenes EU directives on transparency and bid. And then, most disturbingly, Huawei, the Chinese company that the US famously has pointed at, has an agreement with Serbia to install 1,000 security cameras beginning in Belgrade. And when you match this with the total politicization of the Serbian security and intelligence and investigative services under Vučić, under his autocracy, then the scenarios become really quite serious there. Potentially, we have to imagine Beijing getting access either willingly or through subterfuge to Serbian intelligence and even sensitive investigations, all potentially to use to Chinese advantage. Again, here, this is no exaggeration because you have a president of the country who not only is not concerned about Chinese intrusion, but actively welcomes it and promotes it as part of his own political standing. And again, we're talking about a president whose party has parliamentary elections this week. So hoping to stay in the time frame, Murat, I don't want to exceed my time and take away from my esteemed colleagues, but let me leave that as my opening remarks, please.
Thank you very much, Edward. It was an excellent overview of the situation. So we will go ahead now with Ilija. Ilija, we are looking forward to hearing from you in terms of similarities, differences between Western Balkans and Turkey in that sense.
Yeah, thank you, Murat, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this very interesting event. Thank you to my esteemed colleagues. Hopefully we can turn this into a good discussion, but I'd like to use these introductory remarks to really try and draw some parallels, possibly, maybe even more importantly, identify some differences in the nature of the Russian-Chinese propaganda and their strategies and the effects of this on respective publics in these different regions of fields of interest. So as IRI, not only in Turkey, where I'm right now, we have been researching and analyzing these, the foreign actors' propaganda, both in the Western Balkans and in Turkey, both in the pre-COVID and the COVID pandemic period. But before we can start talking about some of the specifics about this propaganda during the COVID period, I think it's important that we establish some sort of an understanding, and I think Edward actually touched and actually covered a lot of it, but I think there's the Turkey aspect that I think we need to introduce here, that it's important that we establish some understanding of the overall interest, I would say, and influences that Russia and China have in the areas that we talk about. So Russian influence, as Edward mentioned, in the Western Balkans is certainly not a novelty. It's nothing new, and throughout history has been mainly determined by the dominant cultural and religious identities there, Eastern Orthodoxy in particular. So because of this influence was characterized largely by, I would say, some sort of metaphysical or irrational attitudes towards Russia. So the bonds of this, Slavic Eastern Orthodox brotherhood and unity has always been at the core of these pro-Russian sentiments. And very often these are not backed with some tangible rational reasons. If you look at Turkey, to try to make a bridge immediately about this, it is almost a completely contrary to this perception that Russia and Turkish public historically has never enjoyed very strong emotional support. We've conducted numerous quantitative, qualitative analysis on the issue in the recent years. And the first thing an average Turk, so to say, or a representative Turkish citizen would say that, he or she doesn't trust Russia, doesn't necessarily like Russia, for all the historical reasons and everything else. However, especially in the last couple of years, the same Turkish citizen would still choose Russia as a preferred economic and political foreign partner of Turkey because of very, very specific interests in the fields of tourism, trade, energy, recently military. So Russia and Turkey has been very good at promoting these, positive aspects of the cooperation. So Russia's positive perception in the Western Balkans is most often rooted in very emotional, even irrational attitudes, while at the same time, the positive perceptions of Russia and Turkey are based on something quite opposite. much more pragmatism, very little emotion, etc. Chinese involvement in the discussed regions, on the other hand, has been based on the main strengths of its, whatever we want to call it, sharp power strategy, whatever it is. And that is substantial and swift financial arrangements and investments, with often long-term dependency conditions. But that's a separate story that we can talk about certainly. So, however, like in the case of Russia, China's influence differs also between the Western Balkans and Turkey. The basis of difference of this influence, logically, is in the respective ruling establishment's political interests. What I mean by this, I'll just want to give you an example. In the Western Balkans, and I will also use the example of Serbia as probably the most illustrative example of a country with a growing Chinese influence. The presence of China is not only characterized by the sort of increasing the direct investments, which, by the way, are still not even close to EU investments. But again, that's something that Edward also mentioned a little bit. We can talk about it more in details. But China also penetrated into a security sector that was also mentioned, with the government in Serbia purchasing this Huawei security surveillance camera system that was already, by the way, set up in most places, in Belgrade in particular. And the president of Serbia, President Vučić, publicly announced that he wants his party to learn and adopt the principles of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China. We're right now in the middle of this pre-election campaign in Serbia. Ruling party they just published today, they ran a video where they used a robot that was brought from China to Belgrade University, and they used it in the video as a prop, in which the robot is literally saying it came to Serbia not only because of the amazing people, the nature, and the great tradition, but also to advance the education for Serbian children using Chinese technology. So Chinese influence in that sense has penetrated significantly into a political sort of political interest and political value system of the ruling establishment there. On the other hand, in Turkey, China's presence is mainly characterized by still relatively modest financial involvement, but certainly with the potential for the significant increase due to growing economic challenges Turkey has been facing. However, Turkey's government has exhibited very clear intention of building as sort of an image of an independent global player, and very often mentioning a possibility of emerging as even a global leader in the post-COVID-19 environment. So this is where I believe the main reasons for the crucial difference in the effects of Chinese and Russian disinformation propaganda efforts in the Western Balkans and in Turkey could be found. In the Western Balkans, generally, we see governments, not only in Serbia, of course, we see governments all over Western Balkans, which are eager to sort of project some sort of strong attachment to big powers, whether that be Western or Eastern. It doesn't really matter, but there has to be some sort of an attachment because of an overwhelming public opinion that those respective countries cannot compete internationally alone. And that notion, that understanding is very strong. In Turkey, President Erdogan has been very firm and focused on creating the narrative of Turkish independence and even global leadership. So this has had multiple strong effects on the perception of a majority in Turkish public. I'll try to give you an example here, another example. So we do a lot of opinion research in Turkey, and a solid majority, for example, right now in the Turkish public opinion, believe that Turkey is in some sort of an economic crisis. However, almost all of those, or I would say a solid majority of that solid majority, also believe that Turkey can overcome this crisis completely on its own, and it doesn't need assistance from outside. This is a dramatically different answer than what you would get, for example, in the Western Balkans, if you ask the same question. And it reflects how strong this narrative of Turkey's independence inside Turkey right now is. By the way, a lot of people who believe that Turkey is in crisis and can solve this crisis on its own, actually are also voters of the opposition parties. So that also tells you, how strong this feeling is. So these differences, in my opinion, in the dominant narratives from the ruling establishments in the discussed regions that we're talking about in countries, do make a crucial difference in how foreign actors' propaganda is constructed, how it's pitched, and eventually how it's adopted or not adopted by the publics there. So I can tell you, and I'll close with this, we finished a media content analysis in Turkey on Chinese and Russian propaganda just now during the COVID times, the last couple of months. And while I cannot share all the details because the report still hasn't been published, it will be published soon, so it'll be available to you. I can share some of the trends that we've seen in there. So for example, the main pillars of the COVID-related pro-Russian propaganda in Turkey was to reinforce the general ideas of the ongoing governance crisis in the Western liberal democracies, primarily US and EU, now viewed through the prism of pandemic, but also to kind of remind or kind of reinforce this idea that the governance problem is systematic and democracy as a concept and the system of values is just failing. On the other hand, emphasizing, of course, Russians, how sufficient Russia is in self-sufficient in terms of state financial medical capacities to deal with the virus. That was the positive part of the propaganda. In terms of percentages, I think this is important to note. We identified during these couple of months that about 15% of all broadcast news from Kremlin's or pro-Kremlin's outlets in Turkey were openly propagandistic in our understanding, and just under 10% on the web. Pro-Chinese outlets focused mainly on also pointing out supposed failures of the Western systems. It was a little more personalized in the case of the US. The target was more President Trump as a symbol of, supposed Western decadence. And in terms of more non-confrontational propaganda, China was really heavily focused on trying to enforce the idea that China is not responsible for the pandemic, and that the accusations on China's account are also preventing the international cooperation in the fight against the virus. And here's where we noticed the difference, that the percentage of the content we identified as a propaganda in the Chinese outlet and pro-Chinese outlet case was a little over 50% in the broadcast outlets and around 25% on the web. So the difference in the percentages of propaganda pieces between the pro-Russian and pro-Chinese media outlets indicate probably that Chinese propaganda tends to consume much more space in the programming of these media outlets. It's much less subtle, and it's much more blatant than what we're seeing on the Russian side. An interesting thing I think I need to point here is that, and it reinforces my main message, my main point here, and I will be finishing soon in a second. So we also were tracking some of the pro-government media outlets in Turkey, the Turkuaz, for example, media group, outlets like A News and Sabah newspaper for the people who know Turkey's media landscape well. During this period, besides some of the propagandistic material, which was totally in line with pro-Russian and pro-Chinese outlets, these pro-government channels in Turkey also published news pieces that were very clearly critical of both Russia and China during this period. So it was clear that and it was done just because at that particular time, these news articles, news stories or whatever, they favored the official narrative of the Turkish government. And this is what I want to reinforce. This is basically, again, we can see the difference between the Western Balkans, the penetration and the effects of the propaganda in the Western Balkans and Turkey. So while in Turkey, the foreign actors' propaganda is propped up by the pro-government media only, if it fits the Turkish government's narrative, in the Western Balkans, the acceptance of Russian-Chinese propaganda is much less critical. So this had really direct effect on some of the publics there. For example, in Serbia, we mentioned it recently, there were polls done, different sources, of course, and I'm sure you've seen some of these. They were widely publicized. Around 40% recently identified China, in Serbia, recently identified China as the biggest foreign donor, which is, of course, very far from reality, from truth. Additionally, also, according to IRI, recent poll, which was conducted in all of the Western Balkan countries, and I invite you to actually go take a look at it. It's on IRI's website, published. There's a lot of nice, interesting comparisons there. 70% in Serbia saw China as the most important economic partner. So I'll close with this. In my opinion, in order to fully understand the tactics, the nature, the potential effects in the public opinion and policy making even of Russian and Chinese state propaganda and disinformation, it is crucial that we understand that the host governments in these discussed places exercise a lot of power, first of all, over mainstream media there. and the public discourse, and therefore are really crucial in directly affecting the actions and the nature, the effects of foreign actors' propaganda. So I'll close with this, and then hopefully we can turn this into an interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilija. Nevşin, how do you see as a Turkish journalist? Also, Ilija was mentioning the pro-government media, but also there's huge difference between pro-government or mainstream media in Turkey and all these alternative sources, new media, independent media, and some of them we can even call opposition media because they clearly support certain political parties. Do you see also any difference between these two groups in terms of Russian and Chinese propaganda? They can reach out to both groups sometimes, or not really?
They can. I'm going to explain, but as a journalist, I'm a journalist, and hello from Istanbul. I'm going to try to give some concrete examples from what I've seen in Turkish media, both in social media and traditional media. However, I want to start by saying, actually, I want to just remind, Turkey had an independence war against Western countries like Britain, Italy, France, Greece. However, ironically, in a sense, Kemalist revolution was a pro-Western revolution. So Turkey was actually established on Western values and Western aspirations, principles, I'd say. However, anti-Western thought was built brick by brick by benchmarks in Turkish contemporary history. I mean, maybe one example, US forcing the ban on opium production in Turkey. This was a benchmark. This was a turning point. Cyprus was another turning point. Then disappointment with the EU had been another turning point. And we now have actually a Euro-Asianist, what we call, vessel, a Euro-Asianist, how shall I say, sentiment in Turkish politics. So, and amazingly, probably some of our new listeners are going to be like shocked a little bit, especially within the secular population of Turkey. We see a more sympathetic perception towards Russia, China, and even Iran. But maybe we can discuss further later. So I've prepared some examples to explain to our viewers, listeners. Let me share. So let me start by this one. I'm sorry, I prepared the presentation on my phone. This looks much better, but that's a Gallup poll. And in this Gallup poll, basically they asked, do you think there are some foreign power who deliberately spread coronavirus? And nearly 50% of Turkish people think, yes, there is like a foreign power between this and they're spreading coronavirus. So who did that? This is a poll by Istanbul, a polling agency. That's a Turkish firm, trustable. Basically, 37% of Turks, they think coronavirus was produced by the United States to hurt China. And almost 39.5% of Turks think coronavirus was produced by Chinese in a laboratory. So it's like we see even there's people are suspicious towards both the United States and China. And also Turkish media was in a sense divided by that, you can say, but rather than the traditional media, because of the special situation that Turkey is being, turning more authoritarian, and there's more control over traditional media in Turkey, a lot of people are turning to social media sites to get their information, like Facebook or Twitter or WhatsApp sometimes. And we have been able to observe a lot of tweets actually saying how Western institutions failed fighting COVID-19. There were a lot of tweets showing how people in the United States were not getting treated because they did not have the health insurance or they did not have money, so they were left to die on the street because that's how America is. And even there were some tweets claiming that people in Germany were not being treated unless they paid. This was a big disinformation because health services was free in Germany, basically. But we have seen these tweets being retweeted and being mentioned a lot on social media. So this is what we've been seeing in this, in a sense, how shall I call it, hybrid warfare of Russia and China towards the West. You know, like always the narrative is Western institutions simply do not work. And so during this COVID-19 crisis, we've seen this narrative also working and being spread on social media. However, I agree with Ilija. There's a difference between a Russian strategy and Chinese strategy. Maybe it's really, of course, hard to prove, but we see Russia being more active on social media, and China, we've seen during this COVID crisis, more active on traditional media. One example I want to give, this is a page of Hürriyet newspaper. Hürriyet newspaper used to be the most prominent newspaper in Turkey. Then, you know, it has a history. It was sold from one boss to another. Now it's a government mouthpiece, but traditionally, Hürriyet used to be the main newspaper of Turkey. So what this is an ad given by Xinhua agency. Xinhua agency with this ad is answering the claim that the United States put forward during this COVID-19 crisis. If you remember, there was this big problem between China and the United States, where the United States accused China of hiding this virus at the very beginning. And people, I mean, Western countries, a lot of Western countries were claiming that if China actually were honest in the beginning, this virus would not spread that much. So Xinhua agency actually prepared this whole ad, like big, detailed paper about how China actually, from the beginning, did the right thing. This was an ad. And one more example. During this COVID-19 crisis, I did a series of video interviews for Sözcü outlet. And Sözcü, according to latest Reuters report on Turkish media, Sözcü is the second most trusted outlet in Turkish media. So we prepared for the social media these video interviews. And Sözcü was contacted by the Chinese embassy. So Chinese embassy came to us. We did not go to them. They said they wanted to give an interview to my video series. And I have talked to Mr. Cheng Weihua, as you can see, in my video interview, a diplomat from the Chinese embassy. He was super sympathetic, a really, you know, like a good face, I'd say. And like as a note, I would maybe add, like we're now living in an era of images and videos. And as you know, if I was a politician or if I was the state, I would really choose my diplomats in accordance with this. So he was super sympathetic with a baby face and everything. And he also spoke perfect Turkish. This is one thing we never see with Western diplomats. Like you rarely see an American or European diplomat speaking Turkish, especially this well. So he's speaking very fluent Turkish. We did the interview in Turkish, that was effective. However, my COVID video interview series, I planned it like, you know, like Deutsche Welle's Conflict Zone or BBC's Hard Talk. So I was like pushing him with questions. And actually, Mr. Weihua was a little bit surprised because he's given interviews to other Turkish TV channels, prominent Turkish TV channels also. And mostly the questions asked to him were about how China actually has bet this virus. What did they do in Wuhan and overcame this? So he had favorable questions. However, I pushed him a little bit. I asked him about all these, masks they've sent to Australia, which actually did not work. That kind. And I also asked him if they tried to cover this virus at the very beginning. He was a little bit surprised and he couldn't answer some of the questions. Apparently, so what I observed, he did not expect such questions from a Turkish journalist, which is also interesting. And in the end, I also asked him what he thought about this latest Chinese, back then it was a Chinese theory, that the patient zero was actually coming from the United States. He did not want to comment on that. He said, I don't want to talk about conspiracy theories. So that's an important note, I'd say. However, there is one other point, though. This is what we see in the Turkish media. Now, Turkey has a new presidential system. With the 2017 referendum, we switched to a presidential system. This system does not allow coalitions, but we are governed by alliances. And now we have an alliance with Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the head of AK Party, MHP, the Nationalist Party, and one of the small cooperators, or how shall I say? Yeah, one of the small members of this alliance is actually Vatan Partisi, which is I'd say actually resembles in a sense German AfD. They are not, they wouldn't say they're national right, but they are Eurasianists. This is Doğu Perinçek, the head of Vatan Partisi. He was and still is a very prominent Maoist in Turkey. He goes to China often. He has a newspaper, Vatan Partisi has a newspaper called Aydınlık, which is like a mouthpiece of the Chinese state, I would say. And you can see Doğu Perinçek's son going to China often for business deals. And actually one of the richest businessmen in Turkey, Ethem Sancak, who is also known to be a pro-government person, which is a close friend of Recep Tayyip Erdogan. He was actually pictured in Aydınlık newspaper once when he went to China to make deals, and he was escorted by Doğu Perinçek's son. So, I mean, I want to give you an example of these, grift relationship. Here, Doğu Perinçek is talking to Chinese television, and actually what he's saying in this interview that he's supporting Chinese politics towards Urumqi people, towards Muslims in China, and he's claiming that actually how Turkey misunderstand these camps built for Muslim people, and they were actually education centers. So, I mean, I want to note again, Doğu Perinçek is one of the members of the alliance in power. So that's also probably important to understand. On the other hand, this is a website of Chinese radio, CRI. They are broadcasting in Turkish. They have a radio broadcast. They're not that effective, but I'd say Russian Sputnik is much more effective than Chinese radio. But we see that China wants to be a player in Turkey and wants its voice to be heard. Thank you.
Thank you, Nevşin. So I think Edward is not among us anymore, but I'm sure he will come back. So I would like to follow up with one question for both of you, actually, because we were talking about what China and Russia have been doing. But don't you agree that we should also question what the West has been failing to do, what the US and the EU failing to do? I mean, if a Chinese diplomat is going around telling their side of the story, why not there is no EU diplomat in Turkey doing the same? While the EU has been doing a lot in Turkey for refugees, for other issues, I've never seen a good Turkish-speaking European diplomat going to Turkish TV, talking about Turkey-EU relations, what EU has been doing. Shouldn't we raise this issue as well?
Can I just
sure.
Answer shortly? I mean, we never had a pro-EU movement. You see, we have a Maoist movement, we have pro-Chinese, and we have these Eurasianist people, they're vocal. But we never had, EU supporters. There were politicians who were supporting the EU, but it was not because of the European principles, or as such, it was because of pragmatic reasons. I think that's the problem Turkey has. And I believe now the West has a big problem explaining what it is and itself to Turkish people.
I will just repeat the question before going ahead with Ilija. Edward, welcome back. So my question was, we were talking about what China and Russia have been doing, but do you also agree that we should also talk about what West failed to do, both in the Western Balkans and Turkey, in terms of communicating their messages? Because they've been doing a lot, both in the Western Balkans and Turkey, but we don't really see similar examples, similar communication campaigns. It doesn't need to be propaganda, but they cannot even explain to public, reach out to public about what they've been doing in these countries. So I will continue with Ilija, but I will be happy to hear more from you especially regarding the US. Ilija?
Thank you, Mark.
Sure, and I think in the beginning, I think I hinted at this, the kind of convenient part of the communication propaganda strategies of particularly Russia in the recent years was that Russia did not, in some of these places, Russia did not actually have to offer any kind of real alternative sort of vision of the future that is value-based, that is rooted in some long-term visions. For the most part, particularly in the Western Balkans, Russia's strategy was, disruption, disruption, disruption. With more emphasis, of course, on the Atlantic part of the Euro-Atlantic integration issue. In terms of Turkey, there was lately we've been discussing a lot of these, the sort of tensions and misunderstandings that were happening inside NATO. And in terms of Turkey's NATO membership, I think we're seeing another obstruction of Turkey in terms of the strategy for the Baltics that is conditioned, of course, on some of the political and security interests of Turkey. So in this case, there were a lot of questions whether Turkey should be leaving or will be leaving NATO, should be or can be kicked out of NATO. If you look at it from Russia's perspective, from Kremlin's perspective, I think that's the last thing that Putin would want. I think having some sort of an actor inside that sometimes goes rogue or whatever, goes counter to most members in there, would be a perfect setting for Putin's strategy in Turkey. So in that sense, communicating and establishing a coherent, well-formed communication strategy is much easier for the other side, so to say, than for the side of 20-something member countries that have their own ideas and or own visions, can often not agree on so many internal things, and have a hard time actually establishing a coherent kind of message for a particular country. Just to give you an example, just a couple of days ago, Donald Tusk tweeted in support of President Vučić in Serbia in the upcoming elections, gave him a very open support and called him, please don't quote me on this, but I want to say something like a visionary, that Serbia is on the right path, etc. That obviously worked very well for the base of President Vučić, that is, the majority in the voting body of Serbia. On the other hand, this message infuriated a lot of very genuine, kind of original, so to say, pro-European actors and groups in Serbia who did not even understand where the message was coming from. Was this a political message of a leader of the EPP, or was this a message of the EU? So I think there's a lot of misunderstanding in terms of this, on the organizational part, but also the fact that EU always is expected to come in with, set of values, projecting the long-term vision based on these values, and that is a hard thing to do. So I think we're playing in a sort of different playgrounds in this sense.
Edward?
Thank you, Murat, and apologies for the internet situation. I have to before I answer, Ilija, I just didn't hear, who was that official? It was very interesting what you just said. Who was that official who praised Vučić?
Donald Tusk.
Oh, that was Donald Tusk. Wow, that is really quite surprising, and what a stark, revealing characterization and blunder. It would be, for those in the audience who are not as familiar, say, with who Vučić is, it would be as if Tusk heaped praise on Viktor Orban, for example, which hopefully Tusk didn't do. But that's essentially what you're talking about. And by the way, that's not just an idle comparison. Serbia and Hungary are neighbors, and Vučić and Orban are very close. Serbia's closest relationship in the EU is with Hungary. It's not just because of proximity, because they're not traditionally that close. But Orban and Vučić have this affinity, and Ilija's example, I think, is absolutely stunning irresponsibility and probably done out of ignorance more than anything. But Murat, to your excellent question here, I think we have to be very specific, and Ilija used a good word about which playground we're talking about. We have to be very clear about what we're talking about. If we speak about the Western Balkans, that's a very specific playground, and I believe Ilija and I share the view that a lot of it draws on traditional narratives that are not as upset they're affected, but not as much by COVID-19 and various blunders and things like that. And let me explain. So Ilija mentioned, of course, Russia and Serbia have this Orthodox, pan-Slavic traditional connection that's emotional. The same exists between Albanians and the US. It's not based on religion. It's based on a deep, trusting historical affinity, going back to Woodrow Wilson and World War, and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, here to bring Nevşin and Ilija being in Turkey into this, Murat, into our discussion. It goes back to Turkey. It goes back to the post-Ottoman collapse, and Woodrow Wilson being seen as the lone figure, America as the lone figure, as against all of these devious Europeans who would sell out the Albanian people. And that affinity, of course, continues through the whole Kosovo drama with Milosevic and the birth of an independent Kosovo state, which is at the center, really, of Albanian political interest now, is among all Albanians, is really what happens to Kosovo. Not the only issue, but that's at their center. And so you have a very strong pro-American bent, which even figures into current politics in Kosovo, where politicians weaponize any criticism by the US, and this happened with the recent collapse of the government there, deliberately done engineered by Grenell and by the US, this weaponization of any antipathy expressed by the US against any Albanian politician. So that's a backdrop. But Murat, let's step to your very good point. Okay, what's new here? And with this effort of China and Russia to propagandize and undermine and sow this dissension and confusion and promote their own narratives. Here, and what is I think your question is, so, what is quote, the West doing about that? And I believe I share also Ilya's view on this. This is not something that the West is equipped to compete with Russia and China on the same level, because we are democracies. And so propaganda, if you think about it, does not come natural to democracies. To put it in very crass terms, we're lousy at it. I would use a more vulgar term, but let's just say we're terrible at it. And if you realize, well, if you're so bad at it, when there's these official promotion campaigns by USAID and US embassies and things, they're so boring, and they're so unconnected with emotions and things like this, and we will never be good at it. And here's the important point, Murat, in answer. We don't need to be good at it. We don't need our official propaganda to be the mainstay of our appeal to the people of Turkey, to the people of Serbia, to the people of Western Balkans, to the people of Eastern Europe, or anywhere. That's not our mainstay. You know the famous term by Joseph Nye, soft power. Where does American soft power come from? It doesn't come from some State Department's public information campaign. It's from NBA, and it's from movies, and it's from actors, and it's from music, and it's from some political leaders, like, and again, I don't want to be partisan and political here, but someone like Barack Obama there. Wow, an African-American man becomes president. And so this is really where our appeal comes from. And of course, we have to do improvement on official messaging about COVID-19, and this is, of course, the West has to do better about that. Now let's take the particular case here, and let me close with Donald Trump. And this is what's interesting. And I'm sure Ilija knows this. Here's what's interesting about Donald Trump. Nevşin mentioned that, they turned Trump into a foil, and I think she used the term Trump as is used as the symbol of American decadence, which is, I'm sure, correct. Not in Serbia. Not in Serbia. And this is another irony. Just as Russia and China are so popular in Serbia, guess what? Surprise, surprise. So is Donald Trump. So is Donald Trump. Very popular in Serbia. And Vučić, you would think, and again an irony here, you would think Vučić, with his embrace of Xi and his embrace of Putin in this very personal way, just exaggerating the relationship, you would think, well, oh, gee, he must do like what Nevşin was suggesting, and he must then make Trump a foil and Western. No. Vučić embraces Trump as well. And here I think we come to the key point. Why would he do that? Why would he at once here, the Trump administration in China, the relations are going like this in a very serious way. How could he possibly embrace these three figures at the same time? How could he possibly do it? And here's the key word: values. Values. So for Vučić, the values represented by Xi, by Putin, and in some degree by Trump are completely compatible, totally compatible with him. And he appreciates as well, there's a particular dynamic with Trump as anti-Clinton and anti sort of traditional US pro-Albanian, perceived as pro-Bosnian, pro-Albanian, pro-Croatian type policy. But that's part of it. But the wider part of it is, and this is the very serious part, are the values represented. And again, I don't want to get into some big partisan political conversation here, but this is what you have when you have a president who not only tries but revels and represents and inhabits this kind of negative value system that is precisely the opposite of what the United States and the European Union represent in there. So that's, sorry for my long answer, Murat, but I'd see less of a chance that the West will compete in some ways with sophisticated Chinese and sophisticated Russian disinformation and propaganda campaigns, although we have to do better in information policy, that's clear. But ultimately, that isn't the solution. The solution is inhabiting values that are so different from those that Russia and China offer, and ultimately hoping that that is the appeal to the citizens of these countries. Please.
Thank you, Edward.
Can I add something?
Sure.
Can I?
Yeah.
Well, Edward, well, I mean, actually, the same thing goes for Turkey too, because Mr. Erdogan is really going well with Mr. Trump. And actually, this morning I was there's this Kadir Has University in Turkey, and they're doing this yearly annual poll about how people perceive Turkish foreign policy. And actually, we're seeing the anti-American sentiment has been decreasing compared to previous years. And now this time, anti-Russian sentiment is rising. And I think this is due to Erdogan and Trump having good relations. Well, this government, AK Party government, actually built its narrative always on fighting the status quo and fighting the deep state. And also Trump was pictured here by the government, by the Turkish government and government media outlets as the guy who is fighting the status quo, who is fighting the deep state. So there's an alliance between Turkish government and Trump. However, this does not mean maybe United States. So as far as I understand, this government also sees the United States and Trump as yet some sort of different entities, and they're more standing with Trump than the state apparatuses, in a sense. So yeah, I want to note that too.
I'll go ahead with the next question. It's about NATO. So the question is about if we consider this as a security threat, then what NATO is doing to respond it, if NATO should do something, if so, what NATO can do.
Sure. We have been, through our research, talking about Turkey in this case, through our research in Turkey, we have been seeing some, concerning trends in terms of public opinion and the perception of NATO in Turkey. However, there was never an indication in the public, or even, indication in our work with the political establishment here, that there was any serious thought of ever, leaving NATO or anything of that sort. I don't think there is a single political entity in Turkey right now that's seriously advocating for some sort of a military alternative to that. I think, Shanghai Five and all of that is not a part of a serious political debate in Turkey. However, I think one thing that we must understand, and it is attached to what I was talking about in the beginning and what my colleagues were just discussing, I think we have to understand for a lot of these countries with strong leaders, so to say, it is simply the fact that we now have foreign policy that's very often, foreign and security and military policy, very often put to use for a domestic political purpose of centralization of more power. And ultimately, it comes down to what works well for the strong leader in the country. Erdogan's mission and Erdogan's idea is to sort of create a globally independent Turkey that would be able to be a global and regional leader in every aspect. Whether that's rational, whether that's, and how these things are playing out domestically, that's a completely different question. But a lot of these issues are directly connected to that. And I think it's only reasonable to expect that, for example, what we are seeing now, Turkey conditioning its NATO partners on voting on a strategy, defense strategy, conditioning that on recognition of YPG as a terrorist organization in Syria, it is something that we will have to expect that will be coming. And the only thing we can do right now is that every time something like this happens, we have to acknowledge that this is a great opportunity for the interests of Putin in this case, to create more disruption, more kind of feeling and understanding that there's some sort of, disconnect or complete failure of these Western alliances of this sort. And we need to know what to do with that. We have had, numerous conversations, of course, with our partners in NATO about this. I really do think that NATO has to engage much more, especially in the member countries, in the a little bit of public diplomacy, better communication, because we still have a very small amount, for example, percentage of people that used to be in the single digits now went over slightly over 10% in Turkey, who are saying that they believe NATO would be helpful if Turkey saw any military and security challenges. That is concerning. If I was dealing with communications inside NATO, I would be understanding this as a crisis situation, that we would have to do something. I'm sure that other NATO member countries are experiencing similar problems. So in that sense, I think the problem is more on the level of understanding what's the purpose of NATO, not so much at the level of this being a serious security threat, in possibility of Turkey leaving NATO or going completely rogue. I don't think we would be, it's reasonable to expect anything like that. But certainly addressing the issue of understanding why NATO makes sense still in the 21st century. So,
Edward or Nevşin, would you like to add something? Otherwise, I have two other questions for you.
Well, maybe I can just note that, I was just checking this Reuters 2020. It analyzes in 40 countries, social media, traditional media, etc. So in the countries in which people are really concerned about fake news and disinformation are the countries where there's no stable democratic institutions. Like, for example, people in Germany, Germany has taken my attention. In Germany, in Switzerland, people are not concerned about fake news and disinformation because they trust the institutions. So, I mean, as Edward noted at some point, go back to basics, promote democratic institutions. I think that's what we need.
Edward?
Thanks, Nevşin. I agree, of course. And on NATO, I just think we have to be realistic about what it offers, but also hold it accountable there. So NATO is both a military and a political institution. So but it's primarily a military alliance, and it's always struggled with this after the collapse of the Cold War. It's always been primary and originally anti-Soviet and /Russian organization. It's an alliance that was organized against the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and at various times has found a new identity. So in terms of its relevance to the average person, that relevance depends on how much anxiety that citizen sees about Russia primarily. So if you live in the Baltics, if you live in Poland, NATO has great relevance to you. It may have less relevance elsewhere, but NATO also, I think as your question suggests, also has a political relevance. And it's another unifying entity, not just military, but a unifying entity, again, the key word, values, under shared values about what the proper role is of military. All these countries that have joined NATO after the Cold War, and we should point out, other than Malta and Cyprus, I believe, every country that has joined the EU after the fall of the Cold War has first joined NATO. And I believe it is only Malta and Cyprus that are the outliers there. And those processes were less military processes. I mean, how much really does Montenegro militarily can contribute, a small country like that, 600,000 people? How much can it contribute to this big militarily? But Montenegro and others contribute in terms of their values, and NATO contributes to them in terms of their values. And these core democratic values which are shared. And again, that's its importance. In terms of COVID-19, I mentioned the Russian example of going to Serbia with military experts in the NBC, the nuclear, biological, chemical. NATO could have organized some of that. Even selectively and perhaps only symbolically in a few places, but that could have been done. There was some COVID-19 effort on the part of some supply, but that's limited. But the main concern is that it still represents a bulwark of Western unity, and of course under an American umbrella. And again, we're caught in a trap where we have an American president in an organization that is almost wholly dependent on U.S. military. We have an American president who routinely criticizes the organization and our allies.
So it's already 4:09, but there are several questions. So I suggest to go ahead quickly, 3 questions to 3 different speakers. And then if you can respond within 1.5 to 2 minutes so that we can conclude the discussion. Nevşin, I start with you. So there's a question about Twitter's decision to suspend accounts from Turkey, China, and Russia. So the question is about how to find a balance between the fight against bad faith actors and freedom of speech. I think you're the relevant person to ask this question, because most of those accounts, especially in Turkey, were the troll accounts, and you're usually one of the targets of those trolls every day. So what do you think? Could we really consider them part of the freedom of speech?
Well, apparently these 7,000 accounts were now almost inactive accounts. That network was kind of inactive, but they were active before. And yes, they were spreading government propaganda. However, I mean, I have this, in a sense, libertarian approach about social media. I think we shouldn't try to regulate it, really. I mean, it is what it is. So what you can do is basically, as like, I'm going back to the, you know, the stable democratic institutions. If you have these, you wouldn't be really affected that much from disinformation and propaganda anyway. So that's what we need. I mean, once you go into that road, and I think from Twitter's point of view also, I think deleting these accounts was not right, because it's like putting a stick into a bee, you know, cave, whatever. That's like, how are you going to separate from whom, you know? It's like, and they can always come up with new accounts. There's no end to that. So basically, I mean, I'm just laissez-faire about the social media. We don't need any regulation. Yes, there's going to be disinformation. Yes, there's going to be fake accounts, this and that. There are going to be, you know, attacks. I mean, I'm one of the first, you know, 3 people in Turkey that are getting these sexist attacks, by the way. I mean, I get these every day, but that's now a part of our daily life. That's what it is. If you are like a journalist who is on TV, on newspapers all the time, you get this. That's what it is, basically. And regulating it, or talking about regulating it, I think is not a good idea, because once you, you know, invite states, especially states with authoritarian leanings, into this discussion, it will not end well, basically. That's what I think.
So next question is for Edward, but Ilija, please feel free to jump in too. It is about the talks between Serbia and Kosovo on 27th of June. So how basically the West can use this as an opportunity, how they can contribute, and what do you expect from this talks?
Yes, I'm glad the question was asked. It's a right question. These talks should have been the basis for the West to use this opportunity and show a joint, unified, principled effort to help these 2 countries resolve this long-standing conflict in a stabilizing, in a democratic way. But unfortunately, that's not the case. This is a purely, almost purely, I wouldn't say purely, but largely a domestic U.S. political exercise for the Trump campaign, which believes, and Grinnell is apparently quite politically involved, which believes that it will get some domestic U.S. Political benefit by having a White House event for what is likely to be a not very significant agreement. It's not, all indications are that this is not going to be, even Grinnell is suggesting this, but we'll see, maybe if there's a surprise here. But the expectation is that this is not going to be some dramatic settlement of the Kosovo dispute, but something far short of that. Grinnell keeps using the word economic. And so even if it were only that, it would be positive, but it is being done with the active exclusion, even competition with the Europeans, which is not only counterproductive, it's absurd. It's absolutely absurd, because there's essentially no difference in US and European interests in this, or really how they see the issue. In the Balkans, you had great divisions in the 90s there between the US and Europe, because there were these very different viewpoints on the region and who was responsible for the conflict and how to approach it. But you don't really have that. Now that's not present, and so these are manufactured, this is a manufactured problem and so this is a terrible missed opportunity, is the answer.
Ilija, would you like to add something?
Yeah, just very quickly. I think one, I understand and appreciate, of course, the from my position also, I didn't mention I'm a national of Serbia, so I have also a personal interest in this, and I can say the Kosovo issue has been sort of as much of a burden, but also a political taboo in Serbia for too long. I think you know, I don't want to go too much in depth, but about this, but it's been an issue that I think unjustifiably a lot of political actors in Serbia were running away from. Like something that would destroy their careers. I simply don't think that the public in Serbia was all that, you know, toxic about the issue overall. But so I appreciate the initiative. I appreciate the sort of the kind of like the more progressive attitude towards the solving of the issue, and try to kind of even maybe work things out in a little bit of an non-diplomatic way in order to make them, you know, efficient and quick. But I think that, you know, big deals of this sort, especially when there's some sort of a Western mediation, have to be also done with a very strong understanding that these two countries are not only swapping lands potentially, but also need to continue functioning as developing and kind of positively developing democracies in that part of the world. And I'm not sure with this, you know, more almost like an entrepreneurial approach, that's what we're getting in this case. Just very quick example, Edward mentioned, and I mentioned also, Serbia is going to have general elections on June 21st. These talks about the territorial integrity of the country are scheduled for 27th of June. So we understand that all of us can maybe here agree that we probably know what the outcome of the election is going to be, but at least out of respect and understanding that there is something called the democratic process election, there should have been at least a bit of a pause and say, okay, let's wait for the new government to come in and see what we get. And at that point, maybe have sort of reinitiated conversations about this. In this case, we actually have two leaders. In the case of Serbia, by the way, the president who doesn't even have a constitutional authority to talk about this, because Serbia is not a presidential system. We actually have a prime minister who should be involved in these talks on a operational kind of on that level. So we now have agreements between actually, you know, two heads of the state brought together in a room, supposedly signing something like a Dayton 2.0, which is, you know, Dayton 2.0 is something that happened in a completely different environment, completely, hopefully, you know, we would like to think different kind of actors, and that we are, you know, we move away from that. That's not the picture we're getting here. You know, we are getting, again, kind of twisting of the arms of two leaders of the state who are supposedly are, you know, going to go in their room, sign something, swap land, and that's going to be it. That's not going to be a healthy thing, I think, for the way this is done is not going to be a healthy thing for both democracies in this case. So that's just a comment I wanted to make.
Nevşin, Ilija, Edward, I would like to thank you very much, and all other participants as well for their questions and participation. Our next event on disinformation will be next week on 25th on Asia. We look forward to seeing you there too. Thank you very much and have a nice afternoon from Brussels.